Hello all, I'm Lauren Reddington, Programs Director for the American Solar Energy Society, and I would like to thank you for joining us for our monthly webinar series. To kick off, I would like to inform you of who ASES is and highlight some of our current events and programs. The American Solar Energy Society is a 501c3 nonprofit that was established in 1954 and advocates for sustainable living and 100% renewable energy by sharing information, events, and resources to cultivate community and power progress. You can join our community anytime at ases.org/join. Webinar registrants get a special 10% off discount on all ASES memberships, excluding life memberships, by using promo code webinar. There is still time to register for our 52nd annual National Solar Conference, Solar 2023. The conference will be a net zero emissions event and held in Boulder, Colorado at the University of Colorado Boulder and online in a hybrid format from August 8th to 11th, 2023. Head to ases.org/conference to register, view the conference schedule, and check out the full speaker lineup. The 28th Annual National Solar Tour is set for October 6th through 8th, 2023, and will feature a collection of local tours and tour sites with solar and sustainable technologies across the US. Signups are open to host a tour site or local tour, so head to nationalsolartour.org to sign up. ASES also invites you to participate in our online community. This is a space for our community to collaborate, share content and information, and network with each other. The online community is also home to our Mentor Match program, Career Center, and volunteer opportunities list. Be sure to hop online and start engaging at community.ases.org. I also encourage you all to head to the online community following this webinar to continue the discussion had here today. Thank you for listening to these ASES updates. I want to note that this webinar will be available in a recorded format soon. I will follow up with everyone once it is available. I will ask that you submit your comments to the chat section and questions to the Q&A section. All attendees will be able to see the questions submitted to the Q&A, and you can upvote the questions you would most like to see answered. We will do our best to review and answer everything at the end of the presentation. Now I would like to introduce you to today's presenter, Mark Perez. Dr. Perez is lead researcher at Clean Power Research. He is a trained scientist with 20 years of experience and nearly 50 publications in the solar PV sector across multiple roles: C&I development, academia, corporate research, and software development. Mark holds his PhD, MS, and MPhil in Earth and Environmental Engineering from Columbia University in New York, where he was a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow and was awarded the Star Fellowship from the Environmental Protection Agency. He holds a BS in Optical Engineering and a BA in Physics from the University of Rochester. At Clean Power Research, he manages a 5-person science and research team in the areas of high penetration solar, solar potential assessment using remote sensing data, solar forecasting, PV spec interference, DER adoption, and other domains. Now I'll turn it over to you, Mark.
Thank you for the introduction, Lauren, and nice to virtually meet all of you. Okay, let me share my screen here. Bear with me for a second. Okay, well, today I'll be speaking about firm power. So I'll be describing what firm power is exactly. This is a rather new term. And specifically at a high level, it's guaranteeing that demand is met with variable renewable energy. So that's what's meant by VRE, variable renewable energy. So that constitutes both wind and solar PV. These are run-of-the-weather, at the mercy of the elements, sort of intermittent resources. You may have heard the term. And how do we optimally displace conventional dispatchable resources? So these would include the greenhouse gas emitting thermal generation sources we're all familiar with: coal, natural gas, and the like. So today I'll be speaking first and foremost about how plentiful the variable renewable energies are, how cheap they've become and are continuing to become, how efficient they've become, how quickly they're growing, And most importantly, I'll be describing how they are capable of guaranteeing that demand is met 24/365. This is the concept of firm power generation. And if I have time at the end, I'll describe how there's plenty of space to deploy them. One of the common misconceptions is that there is not enough land area to fully transition to a variable renewable future. We'll have to blanket our land and solar PV and the like. And I'll be describing some of the economics also along the way. So first, the plentiful nature of the renewables. Pictured here, and this is an image you may have seen before, published by some colleagues and I a number of years ago, showing the various resources available to us on planet Earth. So over on the left and in the middle are the renewable resources available per year. So this is the amount of energy available per year across the Earth's continents. And over on the right are the finite resources. So these are the reasonably assured recoverable reserves that are still in the ground in the form of the fossil resources and uranium in terms of their energy content, all relative to the world energy content consumption, primary energy consumption. So this includes the current electrical demand, roughly 30 some odd percent or a third of the global primary energy consumption, and the rest, which is mostly thermal energy use. So let's focus on the two largest of the renewable resources here, solar and wind. Clearly there's enough, and the diameter of each of these circles is proportional to the amount of energy available on an annual basis. So clearly there's enough solar and wind available. And how do we harvest these? Well, for solar, we're going to be speaking specifically about photovoltaic electricity production, and wind, we're going to be speaking about wind turbines, both onshore and offshore. So how cheap they've become. So here's a quote, a recent quote from Fortune magazine. Solar PV is rapidly becoming the least expensive technology to generate electricity on a pure kilowatt hour basis. Fortune magazine recently. And indeed, this is the cost trend from 1985 to present day for solar PV. You can see it's descended in price by several orders of magnitude, from roughly $16,000 per kilowatt in 1985 to about $1,300 per kilowatt today, utility scale PV cost. And this is projected to continue descending as economies of scale continue to grow and as efficiencies continue to rise. So efficiency. This is a chart you may have seen before from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory nearby Boulder in Golden, Colorado. And what this shows is the efficiency of various different archetypes of photovoltaic technology from the 1970s to present day. You can see all of these lines are on the upswing as technology continues to advance. So this is conventional single crystal solar, silicon-based solar photovoltaic. This is the mainstay of the solar photovoltaic industry today. And pictured it here are new tandem junction perovskite crystal structure, emerging PV technology, which can greatly increase the efficiency. So this is a rather recent development, but this is going to push the envelope even further. So it's growing quickly. This is the world PV production from 1985 to present day in megawatts, so in capacity terms. And as you can see, this looks very much like an exponential curve because it's growing tremendously quickly. We can transform it to a logarithmic scale. So steps of factors of 10 on the y-axis here from 1985 to present day. Looks much more like a line now. And this equates to roughly 30% per year of growth rate. If we project the same growth rate in the future, we'll have enough PV to produce the entire planet's primary energy demand by 2041, which is pretty exciting. And this is only using 0.15% of the planet's surface. So a very small amount of land cover. There's plenty of space to deploy. And for reference, human infrastructure, so impermeable surfaces we've rendered impermeable on planet Earth. So this parking lots, roadways, buildings, and the like have taken up roughly an equivalent amount of a planetary surface area today. So there's really not much more we need to cover than what has already been taken up by human things. So the cheapness. This is an image from one of Lazard Bank's recent reports on the levelized cost of electricity of various technologies. And a couple of things I'd like to highlight here. One are the solar PV LCOEs, levelized cost of electricity is over here, and the wind LCOEs, both of which are at the very low end of this picture of any of the other generation technology. So let's put a vertical line here indicating the price of the renewables today. And over here are the new conventional generation source plants. So we have gas peakers, nuclear, coal, and gas combined cycle. These are all higher than where the renewables are today. And there are a couple of examples of lower conventional generation technologies. That's these gold diamonds here. The only reason these are lower is because they've already amortized their capital costs and they're just paying for fuel. So these are fully depreciated plants right now. And those are roughly equivalent to where new build renewables are today. So if we project this in the future to say 2035, the renewable energies will only be cheaper and will be cheaper than even fully amortized or fully depreciated conventional generation plants. So one other thing to highlight here is the fact that these conventional generation sources, as many of you well know, come with significant environmental and strategic externalities. So an example of this is the Ukraine conflict and the threatening of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Environmental externalities abound, air pollution, global warming, and the like. And there are far fewer externalities associated with renewables. But they are intermittent. And that is where the firm power generation comes in. How do we transform these intermittent variable renewable resources into more dispatchable sorts of technologies, things that can be relied upon? So firm power, what is it? How do we achieve it? So today I'll be speaking about primarily the least cost firm variable renewable energy power generation. So as an example, I'll show a week and a half of electrical demand in New York State. And this is just a kind of heuristic example, but a similar story is true for any region, as I'll describe later on. And so currently in New York State, the base load is largely composed of hydroelectric and a little bit of nuclear today. And the rest is composed of dispatchable resources. So these are things like natural gas peakers, and these are able to ramp up and down and meet this varying load throughout the course of a given day. This is the extant solar plus wind shape integrated. That's just displacing some of the dispatchable generation now, but it's fine because the residual demand, this remaining yellow portion, can be met by these dispatchable generators like gas that can be just turned up and down. That's not the case in the future if we start to really move away from fossil resources. So currently in the current scenario, we need a lot of dispatchable resource management because the dispatchable resources need to increasingly meet a very variable residual demand after the renewables are taken out, after they're just flooding the energy sector with their variable electricity. And we have electricity markets to do this. And this requires variable renewable energy and net load forecasts that are pretty accurate in order to forecast things appropriately. And it becomes a very complex system to balance things out. And more on this later, but I think that the main point I'd like to leave you with here is that we need to keep in mind that energy markets, when they were designed, were predicated on energy, on $1 per kilowatt hour being the fluid moving, the market fluid, the market mechanism, essentially. And the reason why $1 per kilowatt hour is underlying energy markets is because it makes sense from these conventional dispatchable resource perspective. They're all fuel-based. So you're talking about amount of coal and amount of gas. These are kilowatt hour quantities, where if we move to renewable, there's no fuel associated with it. It's just pure capital cost. It's just the initial cost you have to pay for. The fuel, quote unquote, is free. And that's a very different paradigm that energy markets are not really designed to account for. And as a result, it's going to be very expensive. So as we increase the penetration, it quickly becomes the impacts or the requirements for dispatchable resource management in electricity markets becomes heavier, as we increase the penetration, and we need more accuracy on the forecasts. And you wind up in a situation like this, where you just have way too much variable renewable, and you need very accurate forecasts. The system becomes very complex because the energy markets are not designed to accept a whole bunch of zero marginal cost renewables. So it's going to be a problem in the future. So I argue, and many co-authors argue now, that variable renewable energy must be transformed from this intermittent run-of-the-weather sort of signal into firm, even dispatchable sort of resource. And one way to do this is energy storage. So we move the time, in times of excess, we charge up the energy storage, and in times of deficit, we discharge the energy storage so that we can meet demand. And this is the essential idea behind firm power variable renewable energy. You need some degree of energy storage in order to do this, in order to do the balancing. But it can be very expensive, and I'll show that here. So without any balancing at all, renewable energy is cheap. It's the cheapest, as shown on the Lazard slide, in world history, especially solar. It's cheaper than 5 cents per kilowatt hour. But if we add in enough storage in order to balance things, it increases the cost by orders of magnitude, up to, you know, almost 30 cents per kilowatt hour. So extremely expensive. But when we optimally blend things together, things get cheaper. And you may have seen this curve before, but what you're looking at here is the levelized cost of electricity on the y-axis to firmly meet demand, with on the x-axis the degree of overbuilding and proactive curtailment. So this is overbuilding the variable renewables in order to have more supply when the resource is low. So when you have long periods of low sunlight or low wind, if you overbuild, you all of a sudden have more solar and wind power during those periods, and you need to rely less upon the real storage. And one other interesting thing this does, in addition to decreasing the need for storage, is it decreases price, and it also reduces the duration of the storage. So over here, with no overbuilding at all, no overbuilding whatsoever, we need long duration storage. So we need to have storage size in order to meet the worst case period of low resource. So that could even be seasonal. Sort of imbalance. So we need this storage to charge up all summer and discharge all winter. That's very expensive because the storage is not being used very often, and storage is expensive and it's wasteful. And as we move further on this axis, we reduce the storage needs significantly in the cost. That's the blue portion of this stacked area plot. And the contribution of the to the levelized cost of electricity from solar increases exponentially because we're overbuilding and we're curtailing. And this green portion, the margin on capacity in order to overbuild, we're titling implicit storage because it essentially plays the same role as real storage. It's a balancing effect. So this run-of-the-weather variable renewable energy is monetizable today under extant market rules. You know, you have per kilowatt hour pricing in the markets, and in most PV systems and wind systems are signed up to long-term power purchase agreements, which is another dollar per kilowatt hour sort of mechanism. This optimally firm variable renewable energy is not currently monetizable, or not directly, because there's no incentive for an independent power producer, solar power producer, to curtail currently. There's no incentive to do so because you're remunerated on a per energy basis. So this is just to highlight that we are trending in this portion of the axis. We're not doing a lot of proactive curtailment. We're just moving up the line here, and it's going to become more and more expensive. So the future cost of 100% variable renewable power, as it stands today, without any regulatory changes, is going to be exceedingly expensive. And that's what we'd like to avoid. So to highlight where the sweet spot sits, because as you can imagine, it really depends on the balance between the solar resource, the wind resource, and the demand. And that differs based on location, on geography and topography and all sorts of other things. So we're going to highlight where this exactly sits, and to see if this relationship of overbuilding, reducing costs significantly holds true with two case studies. The first in the MISO region and the second in Switzerland. So let's talk about the MISO region first. This was work funded by the Department of Energy and chaired by the Minnesota Department of Commerce under a project called Minnesota Solar Pathways. This is the MISO region right here, pictured at left. So the MISO region is the Midwestern Independent System Operator. They're the big transmission system operator for the middle third of the United States. This region stretches from the Canadian border up here in the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. And what's pictured at left here is a solar resource, so a lot more sun in the south than in the north and in the Great Lakes. And what we studied here was nearly 100% renewables with solar PV and wind. Here's the wind resource correspondingly. It's spatially anti-correlated to the solar resource. So you can see it kind of flips, much more wind in the north than in the south, and vice versa for solar. We looked at the impact of PV, wind, and storage technology costs. We looked at 2025, a low degree of technological development, and 2050, a high degree of technological development. So differential costs pictured at the bottom of the slide here. We looked at a little bit of flexibility, so keeping 5% of dispatchable generation in play. And this really significantly does reduce costs. We wanted to look at this precise impact on cost here. So let's dive into some results here. So consider one of the sub load balancing areas in the MISO region pictured here. There are 10 of them, which constitutes the Michigan oven mitt over here, zone 7. Consider 2025 a low degree of technological development, just PV with no overbuilding. It's very expensive to do this with just solar and storage because you need a tremendous amount of storage because you need to account for the strong seasonality of the resource and how that doesn't necessarily match the demand. Here we're at almost $2 per kilowatt hour, so very expensive. If we overbuild an appropriate amount, we bring our cost down to 27 cents per kilowatt hour, just up. So it's very economical. And this margin on capacity is, again, implicit storage. So implicit storage is very economical. If we move to the 2050 high degree of technological development cost with just PV and optimal overbuilding, we reduce our cost by 70% in 2050, down to just sub 8 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's a testament to the strong decrease in capital cost expected by NREL in 2050. The same holds true for wind, when done alone. So this is a scenario where we looked at just wind meeting 100% of future load in zone 7 of the MISO region. Implicit storage similarly saves 86% in levelized cost of electricity. We bring our cost down to 6.2 cents per kilowatt hour. But interestingly, because of the seasonal anti-correlation of wind and solar, if we optimally blend the two resources, we can bring our cost down to just sub 5 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's because there's much more wind in the winter and much more sun in the summer. So they kind of seasonally oppose each other, and therefore we need less storage. So we need less overbuilding, and it's cheaper if we blend both wind and solar together. And here, these percentages are where the optimum ended up in terms of the blend, solar wind. And if we zoom out to the MISO region as a whole and build up the interconnection across the MISO region, we can bring our costs down even further, down to 4.2 cents per kilowatt hour. And this is a bit cheaper than load resource zone 7 alone because we are leveraging, we're geographically smoothing both of the resources. So we're reducing some of the variability because it's sunny in one area of MISO when it's not sunny in another, and they balance each other out. Whereas with a smaller region, you don't get as much of that spatial balancing. And we also looked at if each load resource zone islanded themselves. So if we cut the cord to each of the 10 load resource zones in MISO and built out enough resources to meet future demand in 2050 and balanced out the relative amount of solar and wind, this is where the prices would end up. The weighted average price would be 4.6 cents per kilowatt hour, which is a little bit more expensive than MISO totally interconnected, but it goes to show that you don't really need long distance transmission build out. You can deal with much smaller regions because of the power of this overbuilding technique in large part. And for reference, the color here indicates where the relative solar and wind build out ended up from a cost optimal standpoint. Interestingly enough, despite this being the Dakotas, being the Saudi Arabia of wind, quote unquote, in North America, there is still a predominant amount of solar in this region, which was kind of surprising. And then we looked at allowing for a little bit of flexibility. So we allowed for 5% of natural gas flexibility in this case. But again, this could be some sort of renewable fuel, electrolysis with synthetic fuels or something like that. that's much more carbon, not putting more carbon into the environment. So with 95% renewables, with 5% conventional gas generation, we are 17% cheaper than 100% renewables across MISO. So not that much of a decrease, but a little bit, with significantly less optimal curtailment, 17% versus 36%. The reason the optimal curtailment goes down in this case is because the dispatchable generation is ramping up and generating electricity when otherwise either real or implicit storage would be at play. So let's focus on the second of the case studies here, Switzerland. So this study that I'll describe here is the Firm PV Power in Switzerland project, FIPS, funded by the Swiss Federal Office of Energy that we ran maybe 2 years ago at this point. Here we studied nearly 100% renewables with solar PV and hydro. We looked at the impact, again, of PV and storage technology costs in the future, and we looked at flexibility from dispatchable generation. This is the solar resource in Switzerland, very different scenario from the MISO region. So throughout the course of a year, this is at the horizontal plane. Interestingly, so this is in kilowatt hours per kilowatt per day. There's a 7-fold difference in yield between a midsummer day and a midwinter day, which is pretty tremendous seasonality. So there's 7 times more energy from the sun in the summer than in winter. One of the reasons for that is the latitude of Switzerland. The other reason is that there's a lot of clouds amplifying the seasonality in Switzerland in the winter months specifically. This is what the extant energy, this is a stacked area plot of the demand is the top of this stack here in Switzerland throughout the course of a year, the 30-day moving average. And the colors represent what contributes to this, to meeting this demand currently in 2022 or in 2023. So the pink portion is nuclear. The blue portion are the various forms of hydro Switzerland has at their disposition. And the areas, the white areas above this red line of 0 are the imports, and any of the colored areas below the dotted line are the exports. So there's a lot of exchange in energy between Switzerland and the surrounding European region. They have 18 terawatt hours of run-of-river hydro. They have 50 gigawatt hours of two-way pumped hydro. They have 10 terawatt hours of one-way long-term buffer storage. So these are, for reference, lakes at a high altitude that fill with snowmelt throughout the spring and summer months, and then can be dispatched as reservoirs with turbines attached to them at other times. And their objective for 2050 is 30% load growth, a 100% phase out of nuclear power. This is already regulated, and a very limited wind power development in the future with limited hydro growth potential. They've already kind of maxed out the amount of hydropower they can do of various types. So this is PV. We looked at 6 scenarios across Switzerland. Firm power PV is the yellow portion, hydro is blue, the gray is other, existing PV is the orange, so not much, and the pink is nuclear. So you can see in every scenario, 100% phase out of nuclear power. This gray zone of other is what differentiates the different scenarios. And I'd like to focus on scenario 4. And you can read more in the report that I'll share the link of later. But scenario 4 really focuses on 100% renewables. And there is some variable resource mixed in here, but it's all e-fuels. So it's all electrolysis and Fischer-Tropsch method to get to synthetic fuels, as I mentioned previously. So we have the e-fuel price at 20 cents per kilowatt hour, biogas at 11 cents, and wind at 12 cents. We have 2 PV and storage cost assumptions, one for small scale systems with PV at just sub 1,000 Swiss francs per kilowatt, and storage at 330 Swiss francs per kilowatt hour. Swiss francs and US dollars are roughly equivalent, so you can easily do the conversion. For utility scale systems, we have cheaper costs, so 300 Swiss francs per kilowatt and 45 Swiss francs per kilowatt hour, with 2 interconnection configurations. The first of which is an interconnected grid with net zero import export, and the second is an autonomous grid. So that's cutting the cord to the surrounding region, surrounding Switzerland. So isolating Switzerland electrically. Here are the results here in terms of cents per kilowatt hour. You can see there, so the group of scenarios over here, the 6 scenarios on the left are with net zero import export. So this is allowing for power exchange. between Switzerland and the rest of Europe. And these 6 scenarios are the same scenarios contextually, but with the cutting off of Switzerland electrically. And the 2 colors are conservative and optimistic technological costs. That's the red and blue. The red are conservative costs, the blue are less conservative or optimistic technological costs, so cheaper. So the average price currently in the spot markets in Switzerland is roughly 23 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's just to give a relative frame of reference to the average price we're retrieving in these cost studies, which is between 6 and 8 cents per kilowatt hour. So fully renewable future is possible. That would be scenario 4 in each of these circumstances than the present spot price in Switzerland. And there is one thing creating this really heavy spot price, because this is historically high spot price for electricity in Switzerland, and much of Europe is experiencing similar things. This is directly linked to the Ukrainian conflict. So probably won't stick around for much longer, but it highlights the fact, or it highlights some of the risks associated with the conventional energy paradigm. This is a plot of the new PV capacity in gigawatts. According to the Swiss Federal Office of Energy, there are 55 some odd gigawatts acceptable for the Swiss state. So only one of those scenarios, scenario 1, has more than the max acceptable PV. All of these are beneath the regulated or ascertained amount of PV that can fit in Switzerland reasonably. And here's the degree of curtailment. One thing you'll notice here between the 2 groups of scenarios is that the Switzerland as an isolated electrical island, there's a lot more curtailment. And the reason is that, being connected to Europe allows for power exchange and essentially treats the rest of Europe as an infinite battery. Here are what the U-curve optimization curves versus curtailment look like, and levelized cost of electricity for the various scenarios for a grid-connected Switzerland and for a standalone Switzerland. One thing you'll note is the optimum sweet spots all move to the right for the standalone, as can be witnessed here, and that's because you don't have the rest of Europe acting as this infinite battery. So this is what it looks like on this stacked area plot basis. This is Switzerland existing in 2022. And this is what it looks like in 2050 in those 2 groups of scenarios. The first of which is Switzerland still being connected to Europe, so allowing imports and exports. And the second stacked area plot here is Switzerland being electrically isolated. So you can see there's nothing below 0. Everything is met by in-country resources. Key takeaways I'd like to highlight here are that renewables are large enough, cheap enough, and won't require too much land. Firming variable renewables is achievable at minimal cost. And we showed this through 2 case studies in MISO and in Switzerland with very different resources and demand. And these indicate that 100% renewable grids are technically possible and economically reasonable. Implicit storage is the cornerstone to delivering firm power 24/7, 365. Long duration storage and large scale transmission are not indispensable. Implicit storage is not currently monetizable despite being economical. And this is due to the archaic electricity market structure that I briefly touched upon earlier. And furthermore, time is of the essence. So the longer we wait to change market structure, the more expensive it becomes. And I'd like to briefly touch upon this latter piece, this time is of the essence piece. So this is the importance of timing. Market rules currently, as I mentioned earlier, fail or facilitate progressive. What we need are market rules facilitating progressive and effective integration of VREs, optimal wind and storage, and PV balance to deliver firm power. So that we can transform this variable green signal, which is the aggregate renewable or marginal renewable energy production, into something that's firm, something that approximates the actual load shape or the actual residual load shape after the hydro or nuclear or something base loads are taken out. And that way, as we increase the penetration of renewables, it retains the same shape and the cost doesn't really transform tremendously. So how do we do this? We need a firm power kilowatt remuneration. That's the idea. So we need a dollar per kilowatt amount that is remunerating the firm power kilowatt instead of being differentiated based on storage and solar and implicit. And then we can divide it out between the different the different components of the contributing to the firm power. That's the idea. So remunerating the ensemble and remunerating installed capacity and remunerating outside of current energy markets, which again are energy based and which are not designed to facilitate zero marginal cost energy flooding the market in droves. So this will require initial subsidies. So there could be a societal business plan for this, where it's tax-based or something like that. But we need subsidies because right now, as I mentioned earlier, renewables are too expensive, or firm power is a little bit too expensive given current price points for solar and wind and storage. But in the future, it will certainly be economical. And this is a word of warning here sort of graph showing the date on the x-axis and the firm power levelized cost of electricity per kilowatt hour as we move forward in time. So the price of electricity, the price of meeting residual demand will only go up the longer we wait because we're having unconstrained renewables flood the market, and then the residual signal becomes much harder to match. So the price goes up over time, unfortunately. So it's better if we act sooner, otherwise our price will be much higher than it needs to be in order to meet 100% renewables, or in order to meet 100% of our demand with renewables. So in the words of my colleague Jan Rebend from Mediotest in Switzerland, the economic model must fit the physics of the resource and not vice versa. So that's all I think I have time for right now. There are some slides that I have on land use, but I can open it up for questions now, and then we can touch upon some of the land use constraints a little bit later.
Thank you so much, Mark. Give folks a few minutes to put their questions in the Q&A. If you wanted to go into your other slides while folks put in their questions, you could do that.
Oh, sure. Let me do that. Okay. So there's plenty of space to deploy piece. I'll just keep speaking, and then as soon as you get some questions piled up, I can stop. So there is room to grow. As I mentioned, one of the common misconceptions of surrounding renewables is that we're going to need to blanket the land with solar panels and wind turbines in order to come anywhere close to meeting the total demand, but that's just not true. Here's a case study for New York State, a paper we published a number of years ago, where we looked at 55% of future energy being met by solar, 40% by wind, and 5% legacy natural gas, but again, could be some other dispatchable resource, with an optimum solar overbuild of 50%. So we looked at 100% electricity, transportation, and building electrification, and we looked at where to deploy. So on the demand side, in the US, here's the breakdown of electrical demand and the extant energy use from terrestrial transportation and buildings. And this is what it would look like if we electrified relative to the current terrestrial transportation and building energy usage, because electric motors are much more efficient than combustion engines. So we actually reduce the primary energy or the amount of energy required to meet this. This is the total energy we need to generate if we want to meet future electrical energy use in the US, about 8,000 terawatt hours. In New York, it's about 330 terawatt hours, one of the bigger states in the US. And you'll notice that the residential use is higher than for the US proportionally, because it's a colder winter, so we need more heating, electrical heating. On the supply side, we'll need about 190 gigawatts of PV to meet this 55% of the 330 terawatt hours we've earmarked here, which equates to about 360 square miles. And this might seem like a large number, but let's put it in context from a land cover perspective. So where do we deploy? We took two different approaches. One is a land use standpoint using a top-down approach, and one is a bottom-up end use activity standpoint. So here's a breakdown of extant land cover in New York State. It's mostly forest. There's some hay pasture, cultivated crops, wetlands, suburban sprawl, urban, etc. And we've earmarked a certain percentage of these different land cover categories for potential PV deployment. So if we say 15% of all urban land cover can be filled with PV, and this is a seamless integration because we've already taken up the land with impermeable surface, so we're just adding it onto rooftops and parking lots and roadways and whatnot. 5% of open water with floating PV, reducing evaporative loss, and 5% of urban sprawl. 1% of these other categories. This equates to 650 square miles, which is a very small amount. So there could be much more if we recovered some of the forest from the reclaimed forest that the reclaimed forest growth that we've had since the 1880s, when New York was mostly agricultural. We could have a lot more than 650. And then we looked at from an end use activity standpoint, so deploying PV without functional modification. We looked at industrial, commercial, residential building area. We looked at 50% roof utilization. That's 185 square miles across the state. We looked at the power line rights of ways. That's 161 square miles. We looked at pipeline right of ways. That's 21 square miles. Railroads, that's 21. Expressways, the center lanes only, that's 12 square miles. VIPV, so vehicle integrated PV. And here are some examples. It's not going to look like this in the future. It's not going to look like actual solar cells. My guess is that every electric vehicle is going to have just solar paint. It's not going to look like anything because the aesthetics of solar PV are changing rapidly. Here are some recent examples. Here's another recent pretty example. You could do any sort of paint job that you want with solar these days. And then there's the tops of these containers or trucks, or truck containers, which is roughly 21 square miles if we do 50% of all the automobile surface area. Then we have landfills and mines. That's 29 square miles. Parking lots, 24 square miles. Agrivoltaic, 476 square miles. Floating PV, or excuse me, it's 476 square miles with just these elements, end use elements. And if we include agrivoltaic and floating PV, and maybe some of the forest recapture, it could be a lot more. So it could be much more than 476 square miles. So overall, we took two approaches. Ground occupancy standpoint, we calculated 650 square miles. End use activity, we calculated 475 square miles. So there's plenty of room to grow in New York State, roughly 80% or more than 80% relative to what we need to hit our target of 55% PV in New York State. So with higher efficiency PV and demand side energy efficiency, dropping the demand a little bit, this could be even more room to grow than we've identified here. And we ran the study for every state in the nation, in the continental US, and the room to grow relative to what we need to meet 55% of the current demand in each state with PV is pictured here. So the Western states, very little demand, tons of room for solar. There's lots of room to grow. But even the Eastern states, I think only Delaware doesn't have, or has less than, has a tiny bit of room to grow, or not, has not. I think Washington, DC and maybe Delaware don't quite have enough room to grow, but those are extremely small fringe states. So you can peruse this paper for a little bit more information on this. And there's an interactive web app where you can kind of change some of the assumptions regarding the percentage of different extant land cover types that we've earmarked here. And here's some recent news articles, really underlining this point or this misconception that we're going to blanket the land with solar in order to meet our energy goals. So, okay, that's what I had to share on the land cover. Happy to take some questions now if you want.
Sure. Someone asked, are the slides available for download?
Sure. I don't know if you're recording this, so you'll be posting this. So you'll be posting this. The slides I could make those available, sure.
Okay, awesome. And then how would we go about converting existing non-curtailed renewables to curtailed, or in terms of changing policy, shifting the incentives for existing systems, et cetera?
So I think existing systems are planned, yeah, are ready to be firmed. You just need to treat them as smaller than they actually are in capacity terms. So say you're a household and you have a 10 kilowatt system, you could render that into a firm power sort of archetype if you were to consider that this isn't actually a 10 kilowatt system, this is in fact only a 5 kilowatt system, and we've added some storage in. That would firm that resource and make it able to meet your demand. Most likely it's a little bit more variable with an individual household. There are definitely advantages to spreading things out and to being part of a grid, because as I mentioned, if my house has a cloud over it, your house doesn't, and vice versa. So you get some geographic smoothing of the variable resources. Same is true for wind. So the larger an area you look at, the more smooth the aggregate output is. But all of the solar that's installed today could be firmed. You just need to treat it in a different space. And it's really a regulatory question. It's how do we redesign the markets so that they're not using energy as a fluid, but instead using capacity as a fluid. And there are some high-level discussions going on right now in Switzerland, for instance, discussing exactly how these markets are going to be redesigned, because the markets being designed around $1 per kilowatt hour basis will fail, because you have a bunch of $0 per kilowatt hour energy flooding. Imagine once all the solar and wind are paid for, they're fully depreciated, just like the conventional resources. There's no cost. It's zero marginal cost because the energy is free, out there. So once you've built it and amortized or paid for the cost, it's totally free. And that does not work well in an energy market based on $1 per kilowatt hour. It just doesn't. The market designed around $1 per kilowatt hour falls apart in that context in the future.
And is there a place for residential battery integration in the grid?
Definitely. And there are a number of places in Germany doing this already, where they kind of aggregate and they create virtual large scale batteries based on batteries being installed at individual people's homes. And the same is true for solar. The advantage of solar, as I mentioned in the land cover discussion, is that it can be integrated into rooftops, into existing human infrastructure without needing to take up additional new land. It's a little bit more expensive to put it in, on rooftops and whatnot than it is to build it in an empty field somewhere. But that's another regulatory question. Where do you, how do you regulate the permitting of this sort of stuff? I don't know if that answers that question.
And I believe your analysis is based on providing 100% service reliability. What would be the result if we have the ability to manage demand, or let's say accept lower service reliability, say 90%?
Yeah, so that would be the same as pulling back on the 100% renewable thing that I showed there. I looked at 95% renewable and kind of decreasing the amount of variable renewables in there. And it decreases the price and the amount of curtailment or implicit storage pretty significantly. I showed some of those slides in the MISO work, and in the Swiss work, we looked at this too. So demand side management is, shifting demand to match supply. It's just that demand is a lot less inherently flexible than supply. Supply is controllable. Demand is human behavior, less controllable. So on an aggregate, it's just less powerful of an effect as the supply side interventions like implicit storage. But sure, yeah, it helps. If you could move everybody's demand to the summer and move everybody's demand to the day, we wouldn't have any of these problems whatsoever. But that's just not inherently feasible. And much of our demand is not residential, it's industrial and commercial. And those operational profiles are not as flexible as maybe a residential homeowner's demand, which is, not the lion's share of energy demand on the planet. So I would say yes, that it can definitely reduce cost.
You mentioned subsidiaries, but what is the appetite for private funding currently? How would the private versus public funding impact the cost for the development of resources in this initial build out?
Yeah, I mean, there needs to be a lot of capital raised to do the build out, both private and public. It's just that individual actors, individual private actors just have less capital available, so they can achieve they can't achieve as low of a price as, say, a government going in and saying, we're going to negotiate for the entire country a price. It's the larger the group of people, the more money is available and the lower the price can be, because there's economies of scale associated. So, and that's true in any context. It's true in the pharmaceutical industry as well. Like you look at the direct consumer advertising and the individual, drug pricing here in the United States relative to Europe. Like if you're Pfizer and you want to enter the French market, you negotiate with the country of France to set the prices on your drugs. Whereas in the US, you negotiate with the hospitals, smaller entities, and the price can be much higher and is much higher. And drug companies make much more money here than they do in Europe as a result. Same is true for renewables. The bigger the group of people negotiating, the lower the price.
And Tom says multiple cascading questions. First, the cost of waiting to deploy clean, firm resources increases the achievable LCOE of clean, firm power, correct?
Yes.
And the graphs you shared are based on the cost of PV in 2050, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm. At various price points, different projections for cost, but yes.
How does the cost of PV today impact the LCOE cost curve?
So I tried to show those in the MISO work. We did 2025 costs and we did 2050 costs. We did 2025 high and low degrees of technological development. And at the time when we did the MISO work, I think it was 2019 or something, 2018, the costs were 2025 was still a little bit in the future. The costs today are lower than the high technological development cost projections for 2025. So we're already lower from a price point than we projected we would be in 2025 back at the time when we did that. But we did look at short-term, present day costs relative to future costs and the impact. And you can read those two reports. They do show some sensitivity on price. It does change the relative cost of storage and the variable renewables will indicate how much optimal implicit storage you have, so how much overbuilding you have. And the relative price of solar and wind will impact the relative amount of solar and wind, because if wind is more expensive than solar, you're going to put more solar in and vice versa. So it is price sensitive where that optimal point ends up, but the same is true. The same overbuilding or the same power of implicit storage is true regardless of where these prices end up.
And have you studied residential LFP batteries and firming?
LFP batteries? We looked at this is a technology, or this is an sort of analysis that is storage technology agnostic. So storage is just a medium to charge during times of excess and discharge at times of deficit. So that could be any storage modality. And the only thing that's important in the context of the storage analysis are the round trip efficiency and the capital cost of the storage, because there's a little bit of variable cost associated with storage operation, but very little. Functionally, it's similar to solar and wind. It's like you just pay a bunch of money at the beginning and finance that, and you amortize that over the system life. So it could be the same analysis is true regardless of the storage type. the same power of implicit storage and the way in which to achieve firm power, that narrative is still true regardless of which storage type you use. It could be pumped hydro, it could be LFP batteries at homes, integrated. It's just a function of cost.
And what is the status of V2G?
Vehicle to grid. So it's moving slow. And this is a vehicle to grid, this is rendering vehicles on the aggregate capable of providing energy storage services to the grid. That involves consumer behavior, and that involves demand side interventions, which, as I mentioned, are harder to achieve because demand is less flexible than supply. Supply, the grid operator or the independent power producers can control the knobs, to meet demand, which is variable inherently. But having demand be as flexible is hard. V2G is one of the ways in which you could do that, where you control some percentage of the electric vehicles on the grid, and you charge them in times of excess and discharge them. That would reduce the cost because then you have the EV buyers paying for some of the capital cost of the energy storage. That would only reduce the cost. I haven't seen huge amounts of adoption of V2G technology. It's hard to negotiate on it's hard to envision entirely on an economic basis. That I don't know how the regulatory policy would work. That's beyond. We focus really on the supply side strategies and avoid the demand side strategies too much, to any great degree, because they're more challenging to implement. But certainly, if we could do a lot of V2G, it would reduce the cost significantly, because that would be the stand-in for energy storage and reduce the cost as a whole for energy storage for the grid.
Awesome. Well, that was all of our questions. Thank you so much for being here, Mark, and for your very informative presentation. Thank you all for attending this month's webinar. Hope to see you all next time. Have a great rest of your day.